What if Naruto discovered Hinata's cuteness and fell hopelessly in love? Part 2. Lips puckered on instinct and she half expected him to kiss her. However, Naruto's lips molded into a big smile and his beautiful eyes twinkled with joy. You're finally up, Naruto said, pulling his face back to a normal sitting position. Hinata was lying on top of her bed with Naruto sitting right beside her. Hinata sighed. I'm sorry about that. It's okay, Naruto said, standing up from bed. We don't have to go out to dinner if you aren't feeling well. Hinata bolted from the bed. It's not that. It's just, I got kinda excited about going on a date with you. Hinata mumbled as her face broke out in a crimson blush. Naruto grinned. That's good. Do you want to go now? Hinata felt her heart jump up into her throat. And now? Naruto grabbed her hand and pulled her out from the house. They walked towards the center of the village, still hand in hand. Hinata's gaze drifted down to their conjoined hands. Naruto's hand was surprisingly smooth, but it still maintained a masculine firmness. His fingers were long and they wrapped around Hinata's entire hand, enveloping it in comforting warmth. Hinata suddenly realized that people were staring at her. Groups of people were whispering to each other and pointing at Naruto and her. However, it was the look on their faces that scared Hinata. Disgust was clearly written across their faces, but when their gaze turned to Naruto, their expressions twisted into hatred. That girl. What is she doing? That thing. Bits of a hushed whisper made their way to Hinata's ear. She looked up and towards the direction of the voice. She hadn't heard the entire conversation, but the look on the person's face said it all. Hinata felt Naruto's grip tighten and she squeezed back reassuringly. Did Naruto do something to anger these people? She watched his face as they continued to walk towards the center of the village. Naruto's facial expression never faltered. He stared straight ahead, never glancing at the crowds gathering beside him. It was like he couldn't hear the whispered voices or hateful looks. Hinata's heart sunk. Was he hiding something from her? Naruto noticed Hinata's gaze and he gave her a big smile, but Hinata wasn't fooled. She knew that kind of smile very well. It was the kind of smile he wears when he is trying to avoid showing pain. She used to wear that smile a lot back when she was still training under her father. Naruto. So where do you want to eat, Hinata? Naruto asked, still wearing his false smile. It hurt Hinata to see that smile. Naruto's usual smile was so bright and filled with warmth. Hinata promised herself that she would do whatever it took to bring back Naruto's real smile. There is a nice seafood restaurant not far from here. Let's go there, Hinata said, taking the initiative. Minutes later they were standing outside a large restaurant titled Ocean Mist. There was an elderly man in a tuxedo standing next to the entrance. Good evening, madam. How many? The man asked in a very polite and monotone voice. 2, please, Hinata exclaimed as she linked her arm through Naruto's and pulled him closer to her body. The man raised his eyebrow as he stared at Naruto's face. His nose turned up and his mouth curled into a frown. I am sorry, madam. We are full, the man said in the same monotone voice. What? But there is a table right there. Hinata pointed inside at a clearly empty table. There were even several empty tables behind it. We are full, the man repeated firmly. But, Hinata said, her resolve deflating rapidly. Come on, Hinata, let's just go, Naruto said as he unlinked his arm from Hinata and walked away from the restaurant. Hinata gave one last pleading look at the man and then followed after Naruto. There's a really fancy soup place just around the corner, Hinata said. It seemed more like a question than a statement. Naruto gave her a weak smile. That sounds good. As they started walking, Hinata looked down at Naruto's empty hand. She wanted nothing more than to reach out and grab it and hold it firmly in her own grasp. But the look on Naruto's face stilled her hand and she walked solemnly next to Naruto until they were at the entrance of the soup restaurant. They walked in and stopped at a stand with another elderly man standing behind it. 2, please, Hinata said louder than necessary, trying to focus the man's attention to herself instead of Naruto. However, Naruto was not easy to overlook. One cannot wear bright orange clothes and then expect to pass by unnoticed. Hold on. We won't serve someone like him here. The man said as his nose clenched as if he had just sniffed a pile of steaming dog crap. Someone like him. Just what is wrong with someone like him? Hinata yelled incredulously. Just what did he do wrong? The old man scoffed. You don't know. Just how old are you, Missy? What's that supposed to mean? Let's just get out of here, Hinata. Naruto interrupted. We can just go eat at Ichiraku's. Naruto started walking off without giving Hinata a chance to reply. Hinata frowned and chased after her fiancé. Moments later, they were both seated at Ichiraku's in total silence. After setting 2 hot bowls of ramen on the counter, Tenchi and Ayame stared expectantly at the young couple and a light blush could be seen on both of their faces. However, as neither Naruto nor Hinata touched their ramen, Tenchi and Ayame's smiles turned into frowns. What's the matter, Naruto? Usually, you'll have wolfed down 3 helpings by now. Tenchi said with a cheerful smile. I didn't get a lot of sleep. Naruto lied, faking a smile. Both Tenchi and Ayame blushed deeply and Ayame started giggling furiously. So you two are up to that kind of stuff already? Tenchi said, holding back a grin. Both Naruto and Hinata erupted in crimson blushes. They both fixed their gaze upon the counter, neither one daring to look at the other. That's not what Naruto mumbled without looking up. This is unacceptable. Someone yelled from outside the ramen stand. Naruto and Hinata turned to see who had spoken. It was a young girl with long black hair and white eyes. Naruto didn't recognize her, but Hinata must have because she let out a very audible gasp. Hanabi! Hinata exclaimed in shock. Her younger sister rarely left the Hyuga clan complex. Just what was she doing out here? Hanabi strode into the tiny shop and sat right next to Naruto, looking him straight in the eye. Her expression was definitely not one of joy. Hi, Naruto said sheepishly. This is my younger sister, Hanabi. Hanabi, this is Naruto. Hinata suddenly became very uncomfortable. To say that she got along with her younger sister would be a minor exaggeration. I know everything, Hinata. Father explained it all to me. You two are about to be wed. I cannot allow that. This man is a degenerate. Naruto frowned and his brow furrowed. A degen what? Hanabi shook her head, ignoring Naruto's stupidity. How can you be engaged to a man like him? Hinata's patience had already been stretched thin by the day's earlier events. Hanabi's crass remark was the last thing Hinata could tolerate, and she felt the anger boil up inside of her. How dare you? You have no idea who he is. Naruto is the bravest and strongest man I know. I consider myself lucky to be engaged to a man like him. Hinata said with her voice barely above a yell. Hanabi was speechless. She had seen her sister go through some very rough times with both their father and with Neji, but never once did she see her sister take such a firm stance on something. Who is this Naruto and how was he able to instill such courage into Hinata? This was not what Hanabi had expected. This changes things, Hanabi said, looking at her sister through new eyes. Father tells me that you two are currently living at a new mansion he built just for the two of you. I am going to live there from now on. This way I can inspect this husband you are so dedicated to. Hanabi smiled towards Naruto. Naruto shivered. There was something wrong with the way Hanabi smiled at him. It was one of those smiles Sakura would get right before she beat the crap out of him. Hinata's younger sister living with them. Something about this made Naruto's stomach shudder. Suddenly he wasn't so hungry anymore. Hanabi stood up. I am going to go pack my things. Meet me at the house in 30 minutes. Hanabi turned swiftly and strode out of the ramen stand. Hinata sighed. I'm so sorry, Naruto. I'll tell father that she can't live with us. Naruto grinned and Hinata was surprised that his usual smile was back. It's okay, Hinata. She is so energetic and loud. She is like the opposite of you. It's pretty cute. Naruto laughed. Hinata smiled weakly. Ever since we were young she has always seen me as a rival. Everything is like a contest to her. And she usually wins. Just like me and Sasuke, Naruto thought with a warm smile. Maybe living with Hanabi wouldn't be so bad after all. The sun was just beginning to set and darkness began to engulf the village as Naruto and Hinata started walking back to their house. They got there pretty quickly, so they still had a few minutes before Hanabi would arrive. They spent the few minutes they had cleaning up the kitchen and their room. Hinata ruffled up her bed so it looked like two people had been sleeping in it. They had just barely finished when the doorbell rang. When Naruto opened the door, Hanabi stepped in with just one small bag. "That's all you're bringing?" Naruto asked, pointing to her measly bag. Hanabi raised her eyebrow and looked at him as if that were the stupidest question she had ever heard. "Of course not, idiot. One of the clan's servants will bring over the rest of my belongings tomorrow." "A servant? You can't carry your own stuff. How heavy could it possibly be?" Naruto said. A vein twitched on Hanabi's forehead and she reached out and flicked Naruto on the nose. Naruto blinked in surprise. Then he knocked the top of her head in retaliation. "You can't hit a girl," Hanabi shouted as she rubbed the top of her head. Naruto smirked. "I'll let you know if I see one." Hanabi gritted her teeth and kicked Naruto in the shin. Hinata giggled. They were already quarreling just like regular siblings. But it would probably be best if she separated them before things got too out of hand. She walked over and firmly placed herself between them with her hands outstretched. "Enough, guys. Hanabi, why don't you go and take a shower? Naruto, why don't you go and cook something for us to eat?" "Fine." Naruto and Hanabi grumbled in unison. Naruto slouched into the kitchen while Hinata led Hanabi to the bathroom. Moments later, Hanabi was standing underneath the showerhead letting the cold water drizzle over her body. How dare that Naruto lay a hand on her? No one had ever hit her before outside of training. That boy made her blood boil. Just who did he think he was? Hanabi's teeth started chattering and she decided it was time to get out. She turned the water off and hopped out of the shower. She wrapped a towel around her dripping body and looked down at her clothes. She hadn't bothered to bring any pajamas and the clothes she was wearing were dirty. Maybe Hinata had something small she could borrow. Meanwhile, Naruto was filling a large pot with hot water. "Wait, we just ate at Ichiraku's. Why am I cooking another meal? This is stupid." Naruto emptied the pot and put it back where it belonged. He then decided to go to his room and check on Hinata. He walked upstairs and as he turned the corner he heard a door open. He turned to see a very wet Hanabi dressed in only a towel. A blush swept across his cheeks and he turned his gaze towards the floor. Hanabi turned her head and saw Naruto. Anger flooded into her and she stormed over to him. "You dirty pervert. You were coming up here to spy on me in the shower." Naruto choked. What? You're sick." Hanabi shouted as she slammed her palms into Naruto's chest. The sudden weight surprised Naruto and his footing slipped. However, as Naruto lost his balance and began to fall backwards, one of his flailing arms managed to grab Hanabi's arm and she came tumbling down with him. Her body fell directly on top of his and, much to Naruto's horror, her face landed on his and their lips crushed together. Hanabi's pulse skyrocketed and lightning struck all across her skin. She was surprised by the accidental kiss, but her pleasure only increased as she pressed her body into Naruto's. She suddenly found that her mouth was responding to Naruto's agape mouth, moving to meet his lips perfectly. She was actually kissing him. Why did this feel so good and what was this powerful emotion she was feeling? Naruto, however, was frozen in shock. His first kiss was with Sasuke and even though this kiss was also by accident, it felt completely different. Suddenly Naruto's lips felt cold and he looked up to see that Hanabi had stood back up. Except her towel had not come with her. Naruto was stunned as he stared at Hanabi's figure. He could not help but compare to Hinata's. She was much more slender, but her s were slightly smaller. Hanabi was only 12 but it was very clear that she was an early bloomer. Hanabi smiled seductively. "You know, if a proper lady is seen by a man she is required to marry that man." Naruto gulped. How was this happening again? What did he do to deserve this? But, I am already engaged to Hinata. Naruto said, his voice trembling. Hanabi giggled and threw herself on top of him in a bone-crushing hug. It's okay. I'm sure my sister knows how to share. Naruto sighed as he tried to pry Hanabi off him. This was not going to end well. Bright sunlight streamed in through the window and warmed Hinata's sleeping face. With a deep yawn, she began to stir in her bed. She slowly sat up, and as she sat up, the covers moved with her. She looked back to see Naruto, who had been previously hidden underneath the blanket. Hinata smiled. They were sharing a bed just like a real married couple. Hinata froze as she heard a rustling just behind Naruto's sleeping form. She craned her head over Naruto's body to peer at the source of the sound. Hinata's fury awakened as she recognized her sister's face. Hanabi was entangled with Naruto's body. Both of her legs were wrapped around his and her arms were around his waist. And she was completely except for her pink underwear that was barely thicker than a piece of string. Hinata. Face twitched in anger as Hanabi moaned in her sleep and rubbed her bare chest across Naruto's arm. Hanabi. Hinata screamed. Her face began to fill with color as the events from last night swirled around in her memory. It all started when she had come out of her room with Hanabi's pajamas and had seen a very Hanabi sitting on top of Naruto. Flashback. Naruto. Hinata gaped as Hanabi's clothes fell from her grip. Hinata. Naruto said, scrambling out from underneath the Hanabi. Hello there, sister. I was just getting acquainted with your fiancé. Well, our fiancé now. Hanabi giggled. OORF fiancé. Hinata stuttered, turning to face Naruto. Her expression was filled with pain and confusion. It's not what it looks like, Hinata. She just came out of the shower and fell on me and I sorta saw her. Naruto said, unable to look Hinata in the eye. Hinata felt somewhat relieved. At the very least, Naruto had not meant to see Hanabi. It was just a very misfortunate accident. She looked over to her sister only to realize that she was still and had a rather firm grip on Naruto's arm. Would you please put your clothes on? Hinata shouted as her cheeks burned crimson. Naruto's face also burst into a deep blush when he remembered just what was rubbing against his arm. Hanabi smiled and tightened her grip on Naruto's arm. I will only if Naruto honey wants me to. Hinata gulped. Naruto honey. See, could you put some clothes on? Naruto mumbled. What was that, Naruto? I couldn't hear you. You should try looking at me when you're talking. Hanabi said with a suggestive smile. Naruto slowly turned his head to look upon the completely Hanabi. As he did, he realized that she had put her arms behind her back and was thrusting her chest out. The action made Hanabi's S much more pronounced and Naruto was having a hard time keeping his gaze above her neck. Could you put your sea clothes on? Naruto said firmly and then shut his eyes and turned his head back around. Meanwhile, Hinata had been watching Naruto's expression, and as much as she hated to admit it, Hanabi's S were clearly having an effect on Naruto. The thought filled Hinata with jealousy, but she couldn't help wondering what Naruto thought of her S. Hanabi smiled at Naruto, grabbed the clothes from Hinata and then headed for the bathroom to change, leaving Naruto and Hinata in an awkward silence. So you saw her? Hinata mumbled after a moment. Naruto gulped. Why yeah, but it was an accident. Naruto's cheeks burned with embarrassment and he turned his gaze downward to stare at his feet. Okay, Hinata said calmly. Naruto's head snapped up and his jaw dropped. Okay. Hinata nodded. If you say it was an accident, then I believe you. And I forgive you. Naruto smiled warmly. Hinata sure was an amazing person. But there was still the issue of Hanabi and that troublesome Hyuga tradition. Could he seriously be married to two girls at the same time? And even if it was legal, would Naruto have enough energy to handle two Hyuga heiresses simultaneously? One thing was for sure. Hiashi was not going to be pleased. Naruto. Hinata's timid voice brought Naruto out of his thoughts and back into the grim reality in front of him. Hinata was standing next to Hanabi, who was dressed in a very loose set of cotton pajamas. The look on her face made it very clear that she was not fond of her new look. Why yes, Hinata, Naruto said, trying not to stare at Hanabi's ridiculously oversized pajamas. I was just about to show Hanabi to her room. Would you mind waiting for me in our room? I will be up shortly. Sure thing, Naruto said as he turned and headed into his room. He heard the girl's footsteps grow distant as they walked to a different part of the house. He was about to pull a blanket off the bed to make his usual sleeping spot when he remembered what Hiashi had said the other morning. He and Hinata were going to be married soon. And married couples do sleep in the same bed. Naruto shrugged, stripped down to his boxers, and settled into Hinata's bed. Once he was nestled in underneath the covers, he realized that sleeping in his boxers whilst sharing a bed with Hinata probably wasn't the best idea. He was just about to get out and change when he heard Hinata's footsteps just outside the door. Hinata sighed deeply as she stepped into her own room. Just how was she going to deal with this Hanabi situation? She looked up towards her big bed and she nearly gasped when she saw Naruto in her bed. Then she remembered her father's words and took a deep breath. Sharing a bed with Naruto was almost a dream come true, but at the same time it was also a nightmare. She was going to be laying so close to his warm body. Hinata shook her head. Come on, Hinata. Focus. Don't mess this up. Let me get changed real quick and then we can go to sleep. Naruto nodded as he tightly wrapped the blankets around his nearly body. Hinata grabbed some pajamas from her dresser and went into the bathroom across the hall to change. She mentally cheered as she began to undress. She hadn't stuttered or tripped or made a fool out of herself yet. She could do this. She slipped into a figure-hugging silk nightgown that barely reached her mid-thigh. She took a deep breath and tried to calm her racing heartbeat. She opened the bathroom door and headed back towards her room. Naruto gulped loudly as Hinata walked back into the room. She was wearing an extremely arousing nightgown that seemed way too risque for Hinata. And yet it seemed perfect on her. It hugged all the right areas and showed off her slender curves. As Naruto stared, he couldn't help picturing how Hinata's body looked underneath the gown. However, the gown was so thin and tight that it didn't leave much for Naruto to imagine. Naruto's gaze slowly drifted downward and he realized that his boxers were not doing a very well job of hiding his excitement. He quickly adjusted the blankets and began thinking intensely of Kakashi in a bikini. Hinata almost giggled. The fact that she was having this much of an effect on Naruto in just a nightgown was filling her with confidence. She wondered how he would react if he saw her in more provocative clothing. The various possibilities brought a deep blush to Hinata's face and she could feel her confidence start to falter. What if Naruto asked to do that? What would she say? Hinata pulled back the covers and laid down next to Naruto. Several moments passed and neither person said a word. Naruto glanced over at Hinata and blushed. Something had been on his mind and it was filling Naruto with guilt. He knew that he probably shouldn't tell Hinata, but he just couldn't stop the words from falling out of his mouth. Hinata, you see, Hanabi and I. Sorta accidentally. Well, she fell on me and we kinda kissed. But it was an accident. And I didn't even enjoy it. There was a moment of silence before Hinata spoke. Would you have enjoyed it if it were me? She said quietly. Naruto gaped. What? You're not mad. Just what did it take to get on Hinata's bad side? Hinata's face was glowing red, but she summoned every ounce of courage in her body and said, We are engaged, but we haven't even had our first kiss. I mean, we saw each other and we are about to sleep in the same bed. Don't you think it's time we kissed? Hinata forced herself to look up and into Naruto's eyes. She half expected him to be completely stunned, but, much to her surprise, it looked like he was actually contemplating it. I see your point. We certainly don't act like the average married couple. Naruto chuckled. Hinata allowed herself a small giggle. So, should we kiss? Naruto gulped. Probably, but Naruto's voice trailed off as he noticed Hinata was already closing her eyes and leaning forward. Oh well, Naruto thought as he started to lean forward as well. Hinata's face was slowly getting closer and closer. Naruto felt his heart skip a beat as he gazed upon Hinata's face. Her eyes were gently closed and her soft lips were gently puckered. He had never realized how beautiful she was. Her hair seemed so smooth and the smell of lavender emanating from her was intoxicating. Naruto's body started moving on its own and he cupped his hand around her face. He felt Hinata flinch a bit, but she kept on leaning forward. Naruto stroked her warm cheek with his thumb. He was surprised to feel how soft her skin was. Naruto felt himself give in to his desire as he leaned the last few inches forward and touched his lips to Hinata's. Naruto was immediately overcome with sensation. He could feel Hinata's soft lips mold and match his own perfectly. It shot lightning bolts all over his body and butterflies erupted in his stomach. He could almost taste Hinata's lips and it reminded him of marshmallows, soft and sweet. The smell of lavender was even more powerful than before and Naruto couldn't stop breathing it in. It filled his every breath and it only intensified his desire. He found himself griping Hinata's face and pulling it tighter to his own, deepening their kiss. He felt Hinata's hand tightly grip his face and it only sent more shockwaves of pleasure down his spine. Naruto was surprised at the intensity that Hinata was showing. She was kissing him more and more intensely with every second. Naruto was starting to lose feeling in his legs and he laid down on his back pulling Hinata on top of him. Their lips never separated. Naruto's brain stopped working. He became lost in the intense pleasure shockwaves running across his lips and body. Hinata's body was on top of him and Naruto could feel her chest pressing into his. Naruto wrapped his arm around her and started stroking her hair with his other hand. Naruto's skin shivered as Hinata ran her hand down his chest, stopping to trace each of his pecs and abs with her finger. Her hand kept going all the way down to the waistband of Naruto's boxers. Naruto also started to move his hand down Hinata's back until he got to her butt. It was extremely soft in his hand, so Naruto cupped his hand around it and squeezed it firmly. Hinata jumped in his arms and she let out an audible moan. The sudden moan brought both of them back to reality and they quickly sprang apart and sat back on their respective sides of the bed. Both of the faces were red and they were desperately trying to catch their breath. Naruto was still getting aftershocks of pleasure across his body. Wow, Naruto said with a deep sigh. That was incredible. Hinata finished, still breathing heavily. She lifted her gaze and locked eyes with Naruto for a second. She had been crushing after Naruto for as long as she could remember, but never before had she imagined that she would share this kind of intense passion with him. But behind the overwhelming passion, Hinata could feel her love for him grow even stronger. She had never felt this close to someone in her entire life. Those feelings were 100% mutual. Naruto's life had been spent running from villagers and their sticks and stones. When they ran out of rocks to throw, their harsh words did just as much damage. And when he wasn't running from angry villagers, he was training in a remote location all by himself. His 9 tails may have been able to heal all the scars left on his skin, but it offered no protection to the damage on the inside. But Hinata was slowly starting to heal each of his emotional scars. Naruto couldn't help wondering, is this what it's like to be loved? Naruto laid his head back against the pillow and closed his eyes. His stomach was still filled with butterflies and his lips were still tingling, but his heart was pounding and it felt like he was floating. He had never felt this happy in his life. It wasn't long before he was drifting off to sleep. Hinata watched Naruto's sleeping face for a minute. She giggled quietly to herself. He was so cute when he was sleeping. She ran her hand through his hair and leaned down to kiss him on the cheek. I love you, Naruto, she thought to herself before falling asleep. End flashback. Ah, Naruto shouted as he woke up to a Hanabi sitting on top of him. Why is she? Naruto closed his eyes tightly and turned his head towards Hinata. Hanabi, what are you doing in our bed? Hinata said through clenched teeth. Hanabi smiled and nuzzled her cheek into Naruto's bare chest. I couldn't sleep, so I came in here to sleep with my Naruto honey. That's what fiancés are supposed to do, right? And why are you? Hinata said calmly, trying to control her temper. Hanabi frowned as she sat up to look at her older sister. Because your pajamas were too uncomfortable. And besides, I'm not. I have underwear on. Hanabi stood up beside the bed to demonstrate her point. See? Hanabi asked as she pulled on the sides of her underwear. Just what kind of underwear is that? Hinata said, pointing at the string-like underwear Hanabi was wearing. Naruto gave in to his curiosity and opened his eyes a crack. Hanabi was standing with her back to him and Naruto got a perfect view of her exposed bottom. It's called a thong. Hanabi said, playfully smacking her bare butt cheek. They actually are quite popular in America. Do you like it, Naruto honey? Hanabi asked in a coy voice as she wiggled her butt. Hinata quickly covered Naruto's eyes with her hand. How can that be underwear? It doesn't cover anything. Hanabi smiled. That's the point. This is why. But I wouldn't expect you to understand, sister. But if Naruto honey wants me to take them off. Hanabi shrugged and pulled off her underwear. No, Hinata exclaimed as she threw her blanket over her sister's body. But as she did so she pulled off the only thing covering the semi-Naruto. And it was quite obvious to everyone that, little Naruto, was an early riser. Hanabi giggled seductively. My, Naruto. Am I having that much of an effect on you? Or maybe you two did a little more than just sleep next to each other. It's morning, Naruto stammered with a huge blush all across his face. Hinata was also blushing, but she couldn't stop herself from stealing a quick peek at Naruto's lap. I wanna touch it, Hanabi yelled in a sing-song voice. She looked just like a child in a candy store. She climbed onto the bed still completely. She reached out her hand towards Naruto's lap. Get out, Hinata screamed, quickly throwing her pillow on top of Naruto's lap. Hanabi raised an eyebrow at Hinata. She had never seen her sister shout so loud before. What was she trying to protect? She shrugged, blew a kiss at Naruto, and ran out the door. As soon as the door was shut, Naruto threw the pillow aside and ran towards the bathroom, desperately trying to cover himself with his hands. Hinata, however, didn't see a thing. She was too busy staring at the pillow Naruto had just thrown aside. The pillow that had just been pressed firmly against his. Hinata suddenly buried her face into the pillow and inhaled deeply through her nose. It was warm, and there was a faint trace of Naruto's scent on it. Hinata blushed a crimson red and threw the pillow behind her. She had just indirectly touched his. Hinata couldn't bring herself to even think about it. Hinata shook her head, trying to clear her mind. She could think about that stuff later. Right now she had to get dressed and deal with this Hanabi situation. And there was only one person who could sort this all out. Her father. Hinata took a deep breath as she stepped out of her house. She was on her way to the main Hyuga complex to ask her father for help. The Hanabi situation was getting a little out of hand and her father might be the only person Hanabi would listen to at this point. However, Hinata couldn't ask for help without first explaining the situation, and she knew her father was not going to appreciate what she was about to tell him. Hinata slid open the door to the complex and stepped over the threshold. She immediately found her father sitting in the courtyard, drinking his morning tea. After getting closer, Hinata realized that there was a strand of incense burning next to him. Hinata gulped. She knew from experience that when her father started burning incense, it was time to run for cover. The incense meant something really bad had just happened and Hiashi was doing everything he could to not explode with anger. The next bad thing that happened was likely to push him over the edge. Hinata sighed. She wanted nothing more than to run back to her own bed and to snuggle under the covers with Naruto. But this Hanabi thing had to be settled here and now. Hinata couldn't stand watching her sister parade around the house anymore. She would do anything to have Naruto all back to herself. Then maybe they could have more moments like the one they had last night after their first kiss. Hinata closed her eyes and forced the words out of her mouth. Father. What? Hiashi snapped before realizing who had spoken. Once he recognized his daughter, his face immediately softened. Hinata, what are you doing here? Hinata opened her mouth several times, but no words came out. Her father's previous tone had shattered the last bit of resolve. All the emotions she had been feeling for Naruto and Hanabi all came spilling out at once and they quickly overwhelmed her. Hinata burst into tears and threw herself into her father's arms. Hiyashi was quite taken aback at his daughter's sudden outburst, but he managed to quickly overcome his surprise and wrap his arm around the weeping Hinata. Come now, Hinata. You're getting my robe all wet. Just what has you this upset? Hiyashi said in a fatherly tone. Hanabi and Naruto are engaged. Hinata choked out between sobs. Hiyashi raised an eyebrow. How is that possible? I never gave my permission to. Hiyashi's voice trailed off and Hinata could feel her father's arms tense. Are you telling me that Naruto saw Hanabi? Hiyashi let out a low growl deep in his throat. Hinata gulped. It seemed like this was the bad news that was going to push her father over the edge. Just what have I done? Hinata mentally berated herself. Naruto and I finally kiss, and now father is going to kill him. Father. Wait. Hinata please pulling on her father's sleeve. It's not Naruto's fault. Hanabi is just being too aggressive. And Naruto is. Tears welled up in Hinata's eyes. Be strong, Hinata. Quit this pathetic crying. Hiyashi shouted sharply. But his gaze immediately softened as he saw his daughter's frightened expression. Rules are rules, Hinata. If Naruto truly did see Hanabi, in that state then it is Hyuga mandate that they be married. I can't change that. But Naruto is my husband. Hinata shouted with a strength she didn't know she had. Hiyashi blinked in surprise. A memory ran through his head and Hiyashi felt his heart skip a beat. Then, for the first time, he smiled warmly at Hinata. You know something. Just now, you reminded me of your mother. Mother. Hinata silently gasped. Hiyashi chuckled. Yes. Your relationship with Naruto is not too different from the one your mother and I had. Hinata stared at her father in awe. She was very young when her mother had died, so she didn't really remember much about her. However, judging by the look on her father's face, Hinata assumed that this was the greatest compliment he could have given her. Her father hadn't smiled like that since the day her mother died. Very well, Hinata. I will help you with this situation. I will talk to Hanabi myself and hopefully I will be able to resolve this issue without upsetting her. After all, she does see everything as a competition. Hinata beamed and gave her father a tight hug. Hiyashi half returned the hug before shooing her out the door. Now go on back home, Hinata. I'm sure your fiancé will be quite curious about your absence. Hinata smiled as her dad shut the door. Hanabi may have caused a lot of problems, but she had given Hinata an idea. Hinata could feel the excitement bubble up inside her as she walked to her house. But as she got closer, she began to hear what sounded like shouting. No. Stay away from me. I don't wanna. The voice sounded like Naruto's. Hinata picked up her pace and practically burst through the front door. She turned her gaze to the living room and gasped. Naruto was lying on the couch on his back with a Hanabi on top of him. Naruto's hands were waving through the air in protest and Hanabi brought her face closer and closer to Naruto's. Hanabi. Hinata screamed as heat flooded into her face. Hanabi smirked and ignored her sister. She pressed her lips against Naruto's neck. She then stuck out her tongue and licked up Naruto's neck to his jaw. She had almost licked all the way to his lips when Naruto managed to throw her off and jump onto the floor. Naruto concentrated his chakra and, with the help of a hand sign, activated his Jutsu. He was transformed into a busty blonde girl. Naruto laughed and stuck his tongue out at Hanabi. Ha, you can't kiss me now that I'm a girl. Is that so? Hanabi said as she walked over to Naruto. Naruto gulped but he stood his ground, confident in his new strategy. Hanabi grabbed Naruto's hand and pressed it against her chest. Naruto opened his mouth to protest, but Hanabi silenced him with a firm kiss. As she did so, she brought her own hand up and squeezed Naruto's bear. Naruto's brain was on overload. He had transformed himself into a girl and Hanabi was still kissing him. And to make things worse, Hinata had seen the whole thing. How could things get any more complicated? Suddenly, Naruto felt Hanabi's tongue enter his mouth. His breath caught in his throat and for the first time in his life, Naruto fainted. As Naruto fainted, his chakra fell apart and the transformation jutsu ended. He fell back onto the couch looking like his normal self. Hanabi licked her lips and turned to Hinata. Jealous. Hinata's face burned from an intense mixture of embarrassment and anger. However, she managed to pull back her fury and her lips twisted into a crooked smile as she looked back at Hanabi. Actually, I was just talking with father, and you know what he said. The smile melted off of Hanabi's face and she began to grow pale. What? He said Naruto could only be married to one girl. So that makes me Naruto's first and only wife. Hanabi gasped. That's not true. Tears filled Hanabi's eyes as she ran for the door. I'll talk to father myself. This isn't over, Hinata. I won't give up until Naruto is mine. Hinata sighed as Hanabi left. That was too close. Hopefully Hiashi would cover her bluff, but most likely Hanabi would figure things out and be back in a few days. But that still gave Hinata a few days to be alone with Naruto. Hinata looked over at the unconscious Naruto and all her bitter feelings toward Hanabi disappeared. She broke out into a huge smile and went over to lie next to her fiancé. Naruto's sleeping face was so cute. Hinata couldn't stop herself from combing back a strand of unkempt hair. Now was the perfect time to try that idea she had earlier. She kissed Naruto softly on the cheek and went to find a pencil and piece of paper. Moments later, Hinata was walking out the front door. There was a note laid on top of the table that read, Naruto, Hanabi will be with my father for a few days so we will be able to have a few days in peace. I have gone out shopping and will be back soon. Please forgive me for leaving you all alone today. I will make it up to you when I get back. Hinata. Hinata found herself wandering around the Konoha shopping district without knowing what she was looking for. She had seen how Naruto had reacted when he saw that thong Hanabi was wearing and she really wanted to see how he would react if he saw her in one. Hinata blushed at the thought. She still wasn't sure if she would actually go through with the idea, but it didn't hurt to be prepared. Hinata looked up at the entrance sign in front of her. It read sugar, spice, and everything lace. Next to the name there was a large picture of a young girl in a very revealing cat outfit. Hinata took a deep breath and stepped into the store. A young female employee immediately approached her. Hello. Is there anything I can help you with today? Hinata blushed. I was wondering if I could buy a thong. The employee smiled. Of course. If you will just follow me, I'll take you to our underwear section. And you don't have to be embarrassed. Why, underwear is completely harmless. Hinata smiled slightly. Maybe the girl had a point. Judging from her appearance, Hinata assumed she had at least some experience in the department. The employee confirmed Hinata's suspicion as she began to hand Hinata several pairs of thin string-like underwear. Here are several different kinds of thongs. They all differ on aspects such as comfort and appeal. Now, if I may ask, are you doing this for a boy? Hinata let out a small gasp at having been caught. Her face exploded in a crimson blush and she accidentally dropped the underwear she was holding. The employee giggled. I thought so. And I'm going to guess that this is your first time with a thong. Hinata nodded as she averted her gaze. She almost wanted to run out of the store and forget the whole thing, but the thought of Naruto's reaction made her stay. If I may make a suggestion, I would have to say the best choice is this. The West calls it a back thong, but it's very similar to the Rokushiku Fundoshi, the underwear sumo wrestlers used to wear. The employee handed Hinata a single pair of black underwear. Would you like to try it on? Sure, Hinata mumbled as she was led to the fitting room. Suddenly she was alone in a small room with a thin piece of underwear in her hands. Hinata took her pants and underwear off. She looked at the thong curiously. Just how am I supposed to wear this thing? How did it look on Hanabi? A familiar voice interrupted Hinata's thoughts. Hey, Sakura, what do you think of this one? Hinata gasped. It was Ino and Sakura. What were they doing here? She had to get out of her before they noticed her. Hinata quickly stepped into the thong and pulled it on. She balled up her old underwear and put it into her pants pocket. She threw her pants back on and stepped out of the fitting room. She turned to the employee who had been helping her. How much is it? $15. Hey, you aren't supposed to put it on under your. I'll buy it. Hinata interrupted, thrusting the cash into the employee's hand. She then jumped behind the nearest clothes rack and peered over at Ino and Sakura. They were at the swimsuit section, which was only a few feet from the door. Hinata silently cursed. She was going to have to be careful not to be spotted by them. She would die of embarrassment. She slowly began to inch towards the exit. Sakura and Ino seemed to be distracted with a swimsuit, so Hinata stood up and made a dash for the door. She was only inches away from escape when. Hinata, is that you? Hinata quickly took out her old underwear and threw it into a nearby trash can. She put on a fake smile and turned to face Ino and Sakura. Hey guys. What are you doing here? Ino laughed. Swimsuit shopping. Summer is almost here after all. What are you doing? I never thought I would see you in a store like this. Hinata choked. I needed some new, pajamas. Hinata lied. She adjusted her leg awkwardly. This thong is so uncomfortable. Just how did Hanabi deal with it? Hinata shook her head, trying to get the thong out of her mind. Ino smiled suggestively. New pajamas. They wouldn't happen to be for Naruto now, would they? Just what kind of pajamas are they? Ino grabbed a pair of see-through pajamas and showed them to Hinata. Something like this maybe. Hinata blushed and shook her head violently. Ino frowned. Perhaps like this then. She held up a black outfit with spikes and a collar. Hinata shook her head so violently she thought she was going to be sick. Ino laughed. I suppose not. Seeing a shy girl like Hinata in such a naughty outfit, now that is something I would pay to see. Hinata forced herself to laugh. She wondered if Naruto felt the same way. She tried to imagine herself in that outfit, but she couldn't. Then again, she had never imagined herself in a thong before, and yet here she was. Sakura gave Hinata a determined look. So, Hinata, just what is going on between you and Naruto? You said you were engaged, but there seems to be something else. Ino gasped. You don't mean that, do you? That, Hinata stammered as her face reddened. Ino licked her lips. You know, the birds and the bees. A horizontal hug. No. Hinata sputtered as she realized Ino's implications. Ino frowned. Well, surely you two have at least kissed by now. Hinata coughed and lowered her gaze. Her cheeks were burning with a fierce intensity. Ino smirked. Aha, so you have kissed him. Well, how was it? Hinata opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Describing her first kiss was too embarrassing. Just thinking about it made her want to pass out. Come on, Hinata. Was he a good kisser? Did he make your knees tremble and the earth shake? Hinata nodded meekly. Ino sighed happily. I knew it. Summer romance is such a beautiful thing. You know, Naruto is quite skilled at the shadow clone jutsu. You could let me borrow a clone or two. I'm sure there are some things I could teach Naruto. No thanks. Hinata choked out violently. An image of several Narutos passed through her mind and she felt her head spin. Ino burst into a fit of giggles. Now that's not fair, Hinata. Hogging the only good guy around here all to yourself. Maybe I could just join you two sometime. That house you have is big enough to hold at least 10 people. Hinata frowned. You have seen my house. Ino stopped laughing and Sakura sighed. Oops, we sorta followed you home the other day, sorry. Hinata felt slightly annoyed, but she shrugged her shoulders and smiled at Ino and Sakura. It's alright, I guess. It's not really a secret anymore. Naruto and I are engaged and we live together. As the words came out of her mouth, Hinata felt her heart swell with happiness. It was the first time she had admitted it out loud. However, she did feel a slight twinge of sadness. She wished Naruto had been here to share the moment with her. Hinata sighed. She really wanted to go home. She wanted to see Naruto and she really wanted to get out of this thong. How did Hanabi manage to wear something so uncomfortable? I should be going. Naruto is probably wondering where I am. Hinata said as she took a tentative step backward. Once she was out of the store, she would run all the way home. It would only take a few minutes. She took another step backward and burst out from the shop. She didn't even give Ino and Sakura a chance to say goodbye. She sure is strange, Ino said looking back at Sakura. Sakura nodded. I'm curious about this engagement thing. I think we should go visit their house sometime. Ino smiled. I agree. I wouldn't mind seeing Naruto again. He sure has changed since the last time I saw him. Meanwhile, Naruto was just waking up. He sat up on the couch groggily. He looked around, confused. What happened to Hanabi? And where was Hinata? Naruto's gaze fell upon Hinata's note and he reached over to pick it up. He read it once, twice, and then a third time. He gulped audibly and a blush came across his face. Just what did Hinata mean by, "I'll make it up to you when I get back"? Suddenly, the front door opened and Naruto jumped, throwing the note behind him. He quickly straightened his hair and checked his breath. He stood up and walked to the front door with a smile plastered on his face. Hey Hinata. Welcome home, Naruto. Hinata cried as she jumped into his arms. She threw her arms around his neck and hugged him tightly. I missed you. Naruto blinked in surprise. How long was I asleep? Hinata laughed. Not very long. I guess I'm being a bit silly. Naruto smiled warmly and returned Hinata's hug. I missed you, too. Hinata felt her heart skip a beat and she stepped back from the hug. She grabbed Naruto's hand and raced upstairs. She dragged Naruto into their bedroom and then quickly shut the door. Hinata. What's going on? Naruto's voice trailed off as he remembered her note. He felt his palms begin to sweat and he rubbed them on his pants. I bought something for you, Hinata stammered. Naruto checked her empty hands and gulped. It's in your pee pocket, right? Hinata shook her head slowly. Her cheeks burned red as she slowly took off her jacket. She pulled her shirt over her head so that she was only wearing her pants and her bra. Naruto suddenly found that he was holding his breath. His hands were clenched and his pants had grown tight. Just what the hell was going on? Hinata slowly dragged her hands down her stomach into the hem of her pants. She slowly unbuttoned them and let them fall to the floor. Naruto's eyes nearly popped out of his head. I bought a thong for you, Hinata said as she nervously tapped her fingers together. Naruto remembered the thin piece of underwear Hanabi had been wearing. Hinata's was much thinner, but there was something wrong. Don't stare so intently, Hinata muttered as she covered her eyes with her hands. This was so embarrassing. Hinata, I think it's backwards. Hinata gasped and looked down. She was horrified to find that Naruto was right. Her womanhood was completely exposed to Naruto. And the thin string-like thong only made it easier for Naruto to see. Hinata screamed and sank to the floor. Naruto quickly turned and buried his face into a pillow. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to look. Naruto's cries were muffled by the pillow and by Hinata's loud scream. She quickly covered herself with her discarded clothes and ran to the bathroom. She slammed the door and pressed her back against it. She sank to the floor, ignoring the protest of her bare bottom on the cold surface. She felt like crying, but she did feel a sliver of accomplishment. Naruto had been completely hypnotized by the sight of her. Hinata felt her confidence grow a little and she smiled to herself. Maybe today wasn't such a bad day after all. Meanwhile, in a faraway palace, a man was sitting in a dark room with his son. She is already betrothed to another, my son. I don't care, father. You said I could have any girl I wanted and I want her. Asuka Kenji smiled sinisterly. I was hoping you would say that, Hideki. Unfortunately, she seems to be in love with her fiancé, so it will be impossible for us to convince her to just leave. That leaves us only two options. Kidnap Hinata Hyuga or... Hideki snarled. That is not an option. I want her as a wife, not as a servant. That leaves us with only one choice. Hideki looked to his father with an evil grin. Destroy Naruto Uzumaki. Hinata awoke to a warm sensation on her stomach. She pulled the edge of the blankets back a little bit and discovered Naruto's hand. Hinata had been sleeping on her side and Naruto had managed to wrap his arm around her torso. She smiled and craned her neck back to kiss him on the cheek. As her lips left Naruto's cheek, her brain registered a new sensation. There was something hard poking her in the back of her thigh. Hinata looked down towards Naruto's lap and pulled back the blankets a bit more. She quickly realized what had been poking her and a huge blush spread across her face. Curiosity overwhelmed her and her hand started moving on its own. She gulped loudly as her hand grew closer and closer to Naruto's lap. She jumped slightly as the flesh of her hand met with the warm skin of Naruto's bare stomach. She took a deep breath and began to move her hand down Naruto's body. Hinata found herself trembling with anticipation as her fingers dipped beneath the hem of Naruto's underwear. An incredible amount of heat surrounded her fingers and Hinata found herself even more intrigued. Hinata explored deeper until her fingers finally touched skin. Her heart jumped and she felt a sudden surge of heat grow between her legs. Suddenly, Naruto began to stir and Hinata quickly withdrew her fingers. She flew out of bed and kept running until she was in the bathroom. She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. Her hands were still shaking, so she folded her arms and stuck her hands under her armpits. She could still feel heat throbbing between her legs. Hinata shook her head vigorously. If she kept thinking like this, she was going to need a change of underwear. She turned on the sink and splashed some cold water on her face. Meanwhile, Naruto was just waking up from a very vivid dream. In his dream, Naruto kept seeing Hinata wearing the backwards thong that she had worn the previous night. He had put extensive research into developing his Waijutsu, but he had never really seen what a girl had between her legs. And Hinata had accidentally shown him a lot more than he was prepared to see. But for some reason, Naruto was absolutely captivated by what he had seen. And his dreams had only added fuel to the fire. Naruto sat up in the bed and immediately looked around for Hinata. After assuring himself that she was nowhere in sight, he pulled back the covers and raced for the bathroom. He had awoken at full mast, and that meant that he really needed to empty his bladder. Naruto burst into the bathroom and briskly turned around to slam the door shut. If Hinata saw him like this, he would die from embarrassment. Naruto shifted uncomfortably in his tight underwear as he turned around to face the toilet. His jaw hit the ground as his gaze fell upon a blushing Hinata. However, Hinata's gaze was fixed intently on Naruto's bulging underwear. Hinata would never be able to look at a tent the same way again. Naruto quickly covered himself with his hands as a blush burned across his face as well. Naruto gulped as he tried to control his overfilled bladder. Please, I need to use the, Hinata jumped up as she realized what Naruto meant. She tore her gaze from Naruto's body and stepped past him to walk out of the bathroom. Once she was gone, Naruto sighed and went over to the toilet to relieve himself. Outside the bathroom, Hinata covered her ears with her hands to prevent her creative imagination from picturing a scene to match the sounds she was hearing. Her curiosity was getting out of hand and she found herself wanting to activate her Byakugan and peep on Naruto. Hinata shook her head. She decided to take a walk to try and clear her mind. She went back into the bedroom and completely stripped down. She put on a bra and a new pair of underwear. She got dressed in her usual outfit and quietly left the house. If she was lucky, she would be back before Naruto even noticed that she was gone. However, Naruto heard the front door shut and he sighed with relief. He stepped out of the bathroom and went into the bedroom to get dressed. As he was pulling a white t-shirt over his head, his stomach growled angrily. He wandered downstairs and into the kitchen. After rummaging through the cabinets and fridge, Naruto finally settled on a carton of eggs. This should be easy enough. I wonder if Hinata will want some as well. Naruto thought with a smile. He pulled out a frying pan and started cooking scrambled eggs. Several minutes later, Hinata was finishing her brisk walk around the estate. The fresh air felt great and her mind was finally at ease. She took a deep breath as she opened the front door. She really hoped Naruto was dressed. She immediately caught the scent of breakfast and a smile played across her lips. Her stomach growled and she muffled it with her hand. She peeked around the corner and watched Naruto cook for a while before stepping into the kitchen. Back already? Naruto asked, turning his head towards Hinata. I had hoped to have breakfast done by the time you got back. Naruto turned back to the stove and stirred his eggs. Hinata snuck up behind him and wrapped her arms around his chest. That's okay. Now I can help you cook. She whispered into his back. Naruto gulped and a slight blush spread across his cheeks. He pulled open a drawer and pretended to look for something deep inside it. Hinata giggled as she peppered and salted the eggs. Shy Naruto was almost too cute to handle. The morning previous events were forgotten as the two happily worked to cook their breakfast. Hinata had always dreamed of having these kinds of moments with Naruto. Never once had she actually been grateful for a Hyuga tradition, but this one had made her the happiest girl in the world. Naruto dumped the eggs onto 2 plates and turned to Hinata. It's such a nice day. Why don't we eat breakfast outside? Hinata nodded with a soft smile and Naruto grabbed the plates and led the way outside to their immense garden and pond. The garden was square in shape and about 50 yards across. There were stone walls all around it, so it was much more like a backyard than a garden. There was a small plot of flowers in the back of the garden and they filled the area with a lovely lavender scent. There were even several beautiful lavender petals blowing around the garden and in the surface of the pond. The pond was in the middle of the garden and was larger than any swimming pool Naruto had ever seen. The pond was surrounded by soft, lush grass and there was a small stone pathway leading from the flowers to the house. Naruto sat down on the grass next to the pond and placed the plates on his lap. He patted the ground softly, beckoning Hinata to sit next to him. Hinata took it a step further and rolled her pants up to her knees. She sat next to Naruto and dipped her legs into the water. She accepted her plate from Naruto and began to eat as she kicked her legs in the cool water. Naruto gulped softly as he stared at Hinata's legs. They looked so soft and smooth in the water like that. He shook his head and focused his attention on eating his breakfast. The couple continued to eat their eggs in silence until both plates were empty and stacked neatly behind them. Hinata sighed deeply and lay on her back with her legs still in the water. The rest of the world could disappear right this moment and she wouldn't care. All she needed was the man sitting right next to her. Hinata felt her pulse quicken as she turned to gaze at Naruto and found him taking his shirt off. What are you doing? Hinata asked as she sat up. Naruto shook off his pants and Hinata could feel the heat flood through her face as she was reminded of what happened earlier this morning in the bathroom. Naruto gave her a huge grin. I'm going swimming. The water looks so refreshing. He peered over into the shimmering pond. There aren't even any fish in here. It's perfect. Naruto reared back and then threw himself into the pond. Water splashed across Hinata's face, but she ignored it. Her knees began to tremble and she could feel sweat drip down her neck. Naruto. Hinata said, avoiding Naruto's gaze. Come on, Hinata. The water's fine. Hinata gulped. I can't. Naruto frowned. What's wrong? Hinata's stomach clenched and her voice broke. I can't swim, she muttered with a deep blush. Naruto stared at her for a few seconds before he burst out laughing. That's it. Hinata looked up at Naruto. What do you mean? You're a ninja who can walk on water, but you can't swim. Naruto said in between laughter. Hinata wasn't sure if Naruto was making fun of her, but she could feel the corners of her mouth twitch into a smile. Naruto's laughter was contagious. Swimming is easy. Come on in. I can teach you how to swim in no time. Naruto smiled warmly and swam over to the edge of the pond. Hinata's stomach dropped as she gazed into the dark depths of the pond. When she was very young, she had slipped and fallen into a lake while playing on the docks. Thankfully, a villager had seen her fall and had rushed in to save her. But ever since that day, Hinata had been deathly afraid of water that she couldn't see the bottom of. Naruto reached out his hand. Don't worry, Hinata. I will protect you. I promise. Hinata smiled and took a deep breath. Naruto would never break a promise. As long as she was with him, she could do anything. She wrapped her fingers under the hem of her shirt and pulled it off. Naruto's eyes nearly popped out of his head as he watched Hinata undress. He forgot she would have to be in her underwear to get into the pond. He couldn't take his eyes off of her as her clothes hit the ground. Before her knew it, she was standing before him in a black lacy bra and a set of matching tanga panties. Luckily for Naruto, the water was cold and it kept his body from getting too excited. Hinata stood at the pond's edge just above Naruto for several seconds trying to gather her courage. She had no idea that she was giving Naruto quite the view. Naruto quickly checked his boxers to make sure they were buttoned. Hinata sat down on the pond's edge and lowered herself into the water. Her skin tingled as the cool water enveloped her. She felt Naruto's hands wrap around her waist to help keep her afloat. The water hit her stomach and suddenly she realized that she had her arms wrapped around Naruto's neck out of fear. Naruto was making several muffled attempts at telling her that her chest was suffocating him. Hinata sprang back and immediately sank into the water. She felt panic hit her like a ton of bricks and she reeled back towards Naruto. She wrapped her legs tightly around his waist and her arms around his chest. The extra weight nearly sank both of them, but Naruto quickly focused his chakra into his hands and managed to hold his head above the surface of the water. It didn't help much though. Hinata's legs were wrapped so tightly around his waist that he could hardly breathe. Her body was pressed so hard against his that he could feel every curve and outline of her body. And the same went for Hinata. It took several minutes for the fear to subside and for Hinata to realize there was something hard beneath her butt. A huge blush erupted on her face as she realized what it was. She loosened her grip on Naruto and allowed her legs to fall off of his waist. She placed her hands on Naruto's shoulders and used them to stay afloat. Naruto took a moment to clear his mind and allow his body to relax. Once he regained his composure, he placed his hands on top of Hinata's. Swimming is very easy, Hinata. The trick is to not work against the water. Your body floats on its own. You just have to remain calm. I want you to slowly remove your hands and float on your back. Trust me, you can do this. Hinata pushed the image of Naruto's body to the back of his mind and focused on only his words. She slowly let go of his shoulders and let herself float backwards on her back. She could feel herself tremble with excitement. She was actually swimming. Very good, Hinata. Now lean forward a bit and slowly kick your legs at the same time. Bend your feet like you're standing on your tippy toes and kick your legs back and forth. Hinata smiled at the words, tippy toes. Even now Naruto was still cute. She let herself sink a little lower and she leaned her body forward. She bent her feet and began kicking softly. She held her breath and closed her eyes, but the water stopped at her neck. Good, Naruto said with a broad smile. Now flap your arms like a bird. Not hard and not too fast. Hinata did as she was instructed and she slowly began to move around the pond. She opened her eyes and started laughing happily. I'm doing it. Naruto tried to hold his laughter back, but he failed. You're swimming. You look like a total dork flapping your arms like that, but you're still swimming. Hinata's cheeks burned with embarrassment and she stopped flapping her arms, causing her to immediately sink beneath the surface of the water. Naruto gasped and dove after her. He hooked his arms under her armpits and brought her back to the surface of the water. He then wrapped his arms underneath her chest and kicked his legs hard enough to keep them both afloat. I guess you haven't quite got the hang of it. Naruto chuckled between gasps for air. Hinata spat out a stream of water and smiled. Guess not. Even if she had almost drowned, she had ended up in Naruto's arms and that was always a good thing. Even if they were in a bottomless ocean, Naruto always made her feel safe. The strong arms wrapped tightly around her would always protect her from harm and the warmth body behind her would never let her be sad. However, even with Naruto's body heat behind her, Hinata's teeth started chattering. Why don't we head back inside? I'm freezing. Sure thing. Naruto said as she paddled them both to the edge of the pond. They both climbed out and gathered their clothes. Naruto was trying not to stare at Hinata in her wet underwear, but he wasn't doing very well. Little did he know, Hinata was having the same problem. They both walked all the way up to their room, dripping water behind him the entire way. They got to the bathroom and shared an awkward look. "You can shower first," Hinata said, covering herself with her discarded clothes. Naruto nodded and went into the bathroom. Hinata grabbed a spare towel from the hallway closet and headed into their room to get undressed. She removed her wet clothing and wrapped the towel around her body. Without any conscious effort, her thoughts began to drift back to Naruto's body in the pond. When she had grabbed onto him with her legs, she was sure that she had felt his manhood underneath her. The thought was driving her crazy and she began to feel warmth emanate in her stomach and grow to between her legs. "We are married after all. It's time to get serious." Hinata threw caution to the wind and let the towel drop to floor as she turned towards the bathroom. Meanwhile, Naruto had just started to get warm. His body and its extremities had shrunk due to the cold water, but everything was back to normal now. Naruto was just about to get out when he heard the door open. He turned to see an outline of Hinata in the foggy glass shower door. He rubbed the fog away with his hand and gasped when he realized Hinata was. I'm almost done," Naruto said as he covered himself with his hands. "Naruto," Hinata said quietly with her eyes turned towards the ground. She took a tentative step towards the shower door and Naruto gulped audibly. "We're engaged, right? Shouldn't it be okay for us to shower together?" Naruto froze and his breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move a muscle. Unfortunately for him, there was one muscle on his body that sprang to attention all by itself. Hinata took this as a yes. She pulled back the shower door and stepped in. She closed the door behind her and looked up into Naruto's eyes. She could see the curiosity in them and she felt somewhat relieved. They held each other in their gaze for a moment before both of their eyes began to wander. Hinata had never seen a boy before and she was quite amazed by what was in front of her. Naruto's body was so different from hers. Hinata giggled as a thought occurred to her. Naruto's body looked just like a light switch. And if his manhood was the switch, then it was definitely turned on. Her hands began to tingle by her sides and she suddenly felt the need to touch something. Naruto was also amazed by Hinata's body. He had seen it a few times before, but never for so long and in such detail. He was fascinated by her chest and how it moved up and down every time Hinata breathed in. His eyes traveled down her flat stomach to her slender waistline. There was a curve in her body as her stomach ended and her waist began and Naruto was entranced by it. His eyes continued their path downward to her trim thighs. Every inch of her body was intoxicating and it only served to make his body more and more excited. Suddenly, Hinata began to move her hands and Naruto was frozen stiff. The warm water splashed across his broad back as he watched Hinata's hands get closer and closer to his manhood. Hinata gulped as her fingers touched the top of Naruto's member. It felt it suddenly twitch and she quickly wrapped her hands around it. She slowly got on her knees and bent closer to get a better look at it. The heat surprised Hinata. She never knew skin could be this hot or this hard. She moved her hand down a bit and tightened her grip. She could feel it pulse and harden in her hand, which only encouraged her to do more. She brought her other hand up and felt a soft sack of skin that was hanging underneath Naruto's manhood. The sack of skin seemed to have two big marbles in it. Hinata was overwhelmed with curiosity as she fondled the marbles with one hand and rubbed Naruto's manhood with the other. Naruto, meanwhile, was trying not to moan as his stomach did backflops. Never in his entire life had he felt something this good before. Hinata was playing him like a flute and all he could do was stand there and quiver in pleasure. He suddenly began to feel a strange pressure in his stomach and he grabbed Hinata's hands. Hinata snapped out of her trance and looked up at Naruto. His eyes were clenched shut and his lips were being pressed together. "Did I hurt you?" Hinata asked as she stood up. Naruto simply shook his head. He couldn't speak. For some reason, he was completely out of breath. And he couldn't stop thinking about Hinata. Without knowing it, Naruto slowly raised his hands and cupped them around Hinata's chest. Hinata gasped softly and Naruto softened his grip. He gently began to squeeze and knead her chest. They were so soft. They were like big soft toys that Naruto could hold in his hands. He spent several minutes feeling them, but he soon forced himself to let go. They fell from his grasp with a soft bounce and immediately perked up. Naruto was tempted to touch them again, but he focused his mind to travel further down. He traced his hands down her sides to her hips. He took a second's breather before kneeling down to gaze at what was between her legs. He had seen it once before when Hinata had shown him her thong, but that was nothing compared to his current view. Naruto slowly spread her womanhood open with his thumbs, which elicited a soft moan from Hinata. Naruto explored deeper with his fingers, stopping every once in a while to trace around it with a single finger. Naruto kept exploring until his fingers met with a very thin barrier of skin. Naruto stopped his fingers' advancement there and went back to tracing around the outer and inner sides. Hinata began to lose strength in her knees and she placed her hands on Naruto's shoulders for support. Her knees continued to buckle until she slowly sank to the shower floor, ending Naruto's exploration. Hinata looked up into Naruto's eyes and smiled weakly. Naruto reached up and turned off the water. He stood up and grabbed a pair of towels. He bent back down to wrap Hinata's around her shoulders and to help her to her feet. The two of them managed to dry off and stumble out of the bathroom. They let their towels fall to the floor before proceeding to their bedroom completely. Their hands were interlocked the entire way. Naruto shut the bedroom door as Hinata crawled onto their bed, giving Naruto a clear view of her bottom. Naruto took a deep breath and followed after her. Hinata pulled back the sheets and they both curled up underneath them. They locked eyes one final time before they leaned forward to share a soft kiss. Their bodies pressed tightly together as they deepened the kiss. They continued the kiss until both of them couldn't breathe. Naruto pulled back and they both took a deep breath. Naruto rolled over onto his back and tried to catch his breath. However, Hinata took the initiative and climbed on top of Naruto. She pressed her lips against his again for another passionate kiss. Hinata felt heat and sparks swarm all over her body until she began to see stars. A bright light flashed across her vision as she felt Naruto's hand between her legs. She retaliated by wrapping her hand around his manhood. She slowly moved her hand up and down Naruto's rock-hard member as their kiss grew more intense. The kiss lasted until both of them couldn't take it anymore. Hinata rolled off of Naruto and onto her back. Her body craved more, but she decided this was enough for tonight. She smiled widely as she felt Naruto pull her into a tight embrace. She planted one last soft kiss on his lips before they both drifted off to sleep. Hours later, in the dark of the night, Hideki and Asuka Kenji gathered outside Konoha village. Asuka bent down beneath a tree and pulled out a sharpened kunai. The knife glinted sinisterly in the moonlight as Asuka twirled it in his hands. Hideki frowned. Remember, father, Hinata must not be harmed. She is useless to me dead. However, Naruto will only become a problem if he is allowed to live. Asuka sheathed his kunai. Right. When do we move? Hideki smiled as he imagined holding his precious Hinata in his arms. We strike at dusk tomorrow. Hinata. Naruto shouted as his grip loosened. He looked down at the vast darkness below her and tightened his grip on Hinata's hand. Please don't let go, Naruto. Hinata cried as she hung from the side of a cliff. The only thing saving her from a deadly fall was Naruto's firm grasp on her hand. Hinata began to slip from Naruto's hand and he felt pain and fear hit his stomach. He swung his other hand forward to try and catch her, but it was too late. There was nothing he could do except watch as Hinata fell into the darkness. Hinata. Naruto screamed as he awoke from his nightmare. He sat straight up in his bed, breathing heavily with a glistening layer of sweat on his bare skin. He quickly pulled back the blanket and searched for Hinata. Naruto sighed with relief when he saw Hinata curled up beside him. Thank goodness, It was just a dream. Naruto smiled softly to himself as he watched Hinata sleep. There was a faint grin on her face and her hair was all rustled up. He gasped quietly when he realized she was. He watched her closely as they moved up and down while she breathed. Naruto gulped as he realized that he too was. Naruto thought back to what he had done last night and his stomach did a backflip. Suddenly, Hinata sighed and cuddled closer to Naruto in her sleep. Naruto grinned and laid back down, allowing Hinata to rest her head on his chest. Naruto chuckled softly. They had fallen asleep pretty early last night, but Hinata was still fast asleep. Naruto wrapped his arms around Hinata and continued to watch her sleep. He couldn't figure out why, but looking at Hinata's smile made him feel happy. He had never felt this relaxed and content in his entire life. About an hour later, Hinata began to stir from her peaceful slumber. She opened her eyes and the first thing she saw was Naruto's blue eyes staring right back at her. Without thinking, Hinata leaned forward and kissed Naruto softly on the lips. Naruto blinked in surprise, but he quickly recovered and returned the kiss. "Good morning to you, too," Naruto joked as Hinata pulled back from the kiss. Hinata blushed as the logical part in her realized what she had just done. However, she ignored that part in her and listened only to the emotional part of her. And that part of her wanted another kiss. Hinata dashed in and stole another kiss from Naruto. Naruto laughed as he wrestled with Hinata's advances. The two of them kept rolling back and forth, stealing kisses from each other. After a few moments, they rolled onto their backs and tried to control their laughter. "That sure is a nice way to wake up," Naruto said as he sat up. Hinata quickly reached up and pulled him back down into her arms. "Let's just stay in bed all day. I don't want to leave your side," Hinata said softly as she embraced him from the back. Naruto's heart skipped a beat and he turned to face Hinata. "As you wish, my princess." Naruto bowed his head with mock sincerity. Hinata giggled and slapped his arm playfully. "I'm an heiress, not a princess." Naruto smiled. "What's the difference? You can be an heiress to everyone else, but to me, you're a princess." Hinata's lip trembled as she blinked back tears. That was the sweetest thing anyone had ever said to her. She threw herself into Naruto's arms and hugged him tightly. Naruto blushed as he felt Hinata's chest pressed tightly against his own. "Naruto, you make me so happy, I really like you." "No, it's much more than that." Hinata pulled back and gazed into Naruto's eyes. "I have always liked you. Even back when we were still in the academy. You are the only thing in my life that I can actually rely on. You have given me everything I could have dreamed of. I don't know what I would do without." Naruto silenced her with a soft kiss. Hinata's eyes watered as she felt Naruto pull her into a warm embrace. "I really like you, too." Hinata's heart jumped as she heard the words come from Naruto's mouth. "I didn't realize it until recently, but being around you makes me happy. Nothing in my life has gone the way I wanted it to. I was always held at an arm's length. You have shown me what it feels like to be held. You have given me everything I needed, but never dreamed I would have." Hinata opened her mouth to speak, but her voice broke. She tried to hold back her tears, but she couldn't. Her tears of happiness poured down her face as she leaned forward to kiss Naruto again. Naruto felt tears on his cheek as he kissed Hinata. She wasn't the only one crying during the kiss. Meanwhile, at the village entrance, Hideki and his father were putting their plan into action. "State your names and your business," a guard asked as Hideki walked past the front gates. Asuka stepped forward and flashed a small piece of paper. The guard's eyes widened and he immediately made a deep bow. "I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding. A Kenji is always welcome in our village. Should I inform the Hyuga house of your arrival?" "There is no need. We are here on a personal matter." "Thank you," Asuka said with a fake smile. The guard bowed again as Hideki and Asuka turned to leave. Hideki grinned, baring his fang-like teeth. "That sure was easy. Now we just need to find this Naruto Uzumaki. Once we have located him, I will dispose of him while you grab Hinata Hyuga." Asuka frowned. I thought we weren't kidnapping her. We aren't. You are. Hinata must never relate me to what will happen today. Once she loses both her home and fiancé, she will be in need of great comfort. And I will be the one to give it to her. She will see me as her savior. It is only a matter of time before she becomes my wife. Hideki grinned, his eyes filled with lust. With that kind of hold over the Hyuga clan, the most prominent clan in Konoha, the Kenji family will soon become the most powerful family in the country. Asuka shouted gleefully. Hideki frowned and looked over his shoulder. Quiet, father. We wouldn't want anyone to catch wind of our little scheme, would we? We need to check one of these restaurants and see if we can gather some information on Naruto. Asuka nodded and followed after his son. They walked along the street until they came to a small restaurant that was filled with chatting customers. As the two walked into the restaurant, Asuka turned to his son and spoke in a muttered voice. Find a table in the middle of the action. I have a plan to draw out some information. Hideki nodded and headed towards an empty table while Asuka wandered outside and out of sight. Hideki sat quietly for several minutes listening to several of the conversations near him. Hideki frowned as he tried to ignore the elderly ladies sitting just behind his booth. They were merely gossiping about the latest fashion and Hideki couldn't care less about what color was in right now. Suddenly, a lit explosive kunai hit the ground just outside the restaurant. Hideki's eyes widened in terror as he watched the kunai explode. There was a deafening shock as all the windows in the restaurant shattered and burst into the restaurant. Several tables near the entrance had been thrown back into some very unlucky patrons. The majority of the customers seemed unhurt, but several were nursing deep cuts and bruises. Naruto! A voice shouted out from the confusion. Hideki immediately recognized his father's voice and his lips curled into a twisted smile. So this was your plan, father? Hideki turned his attention back to the elderly group behind him. They had just started whispering to each other as they cleaned up the mess from the explosion. Naruto, again, I can't believe he would go this far. That damn kid. This village would be so much better without him. We were cursed as soon as that nine-tailed demon was sealed inside of him. Hideki blinked. Did he just hear, demon? He had heard that sealing a demon inside of a person was possible, but he had no idea there were any successful attempts. So this Naruto was actually a sealed demon. Hideki let a small chuckle escape his lips. This was good news. Very good news. Hideki walked outside and away from all of the commotion on the street. A few moments later, his father jumped down from the rooftops and landed beside him. Any news? Asuka asked his son. Yes. Your plan worked perfectly. This will make things a lot easier. Here is the plan. Meanwhile, Naruto and Hinata were sitting in bed, enjoying a few moments of peaceful silence. Naruto's stomach growled loudly and Hinata giggled. I guess it's time for breakfast. And it's my turn to make it. Hinata said, throwing back their blankets. Naruto opened his mouth to protest, but Hinata silenced him with a small peck on the lips. A blush crept onto her face as she pulled back. I don't think I could ever get used to that, you give me butterflies. She climbed out of bed and grabbed one of Naruto's discarded shirts. She pulled the shirt over her head and it fell down to just beneath her butt. Naruto gulped as he watched Hinata's firm legs walk out the door. Once he heard the sounds of cooking, Naruto got out of bed and threw on some pants and a t-shirt. He then headed downstairs to join Hinata. Just as he entered the kitchen, he noticed Hinata reaching up to the top of a shelf to grab a box of ingredients. However, as her arms reached high above her head, Naruto's shirt got pulled up a few inches, gracefully exposing Hinata's butt to Naruto. Naruto blushed and tried to avert his gaze. His stomach twittered a bit and he felt his knees get weak. You give me butterflies, Hinata's words echoed in Naruto's mind and he looked up to watch Hinata's face as she cooked. What is this feeling? It feels just like the time I drank that expired milk. Does Hinata make me feel sick? Hinata gasped a little as she nearly burned one of her fingertips. She put the finger into her mouth and sucked on it gingerly. Naruto smiled and allowed himself a small chuckle. No, She doesn't make me feel sick, this feeling is different. Naruto continued to watch Hinata cook until she had finished and had set his plate in front of him. There was a deep crimson blush across Hinata's face as she sat down to eat. She had felt Naruto's gaze on her as she was cooking. She wished that she had grabbed some underwear before coming down to cook. Naruto looked down at his plate and he nearly gasped. There was a large pancake on it, but the pancake was in the shape of a large heart. Naruto looked up in confusion and Hinata gave him a cute smile. Naruto felt the unfamiliar twittering in his stomach again as he quickly looked back down at his plate. Naruto sliced a piece of the pancake with a fork and placed it in his mouth. His taste buds almost shivered in delight. This is good, Hinata. Way better than the ones I made a few days ago. What did you do to them? Hinata giggled as she watched Naruto gobble the food down. I just added a few other ingredients. Cinnamon, vanilla, and some other spices. You sure know how to cook. I wish I could cook like you. Naruto said with his mouth full of delicious pancake. Hinata blushed. There are a few simple meals that I see could teach you. She averted her gaze and nervously tapped her fingers together. She was glad that even after all they had done, spending time with Naruto still made her feel this happy. If anything, she was even more nervous now that Naruto had said he liked her. Every moment with him seemed like a dream. Hinata watched happily as Naruto ate his food. He was eating so quickly, little pieces of pancake were getting stuck to his face. Without thinking, Hinata reached over and plucked a piece off of his cheek and stuck it into her mouth. As the sticky sweet substance entered her mouth, Hinata froze with her finger still in her mouth. Her cheeks burned and she looked back at Naruto, who was also blushing. Hey, I was saving that, he chided as he poked Hinata in the side. Hinata burst out in a fit of giggles from the combination of the poke in the side and Naruto's silly comment. Naruto perked up and his face twisted into an evil grin. Hinata, are you ticklish? Hinata's laughter died in her throat. She vigorously shook her head while putting her hands up in front of her. No, I'm not. Naruto's eye twinkled and he made a nimble dash behind Hinata. Are you sure? He placed his hands near her hips and slowly poked her in the side again. Hinata held her breath and tried to hold back her laughter. Her body shivered as Naruto started poking up her sides until he was underneath her armpits. It soon became too much for Hinata and all the air she had been holding came exploding out in a fit of laughter. She pushed Naruto playfully and ran out of room. She stumbled into the living room with Naruto right on her heels tickling her relentlessly. Hinata fell back onto the couch and quickly picked up a cushion to fend off the tickle attacks. She threw it at Naruto and it bounced off his face. Naruto pretended to be stunned as Hinata picked up another cushion. She held the second cushion in front of her like a shield as laughter continued to bubble from her mouth. Stop it. I can't breathe. Hinata cried in between giggles. Naruto obeyed and withdrew his fingers, allowing Hinata to catch her breath. He sat down on the couch next to her feet. Hinata lifted up her legs for a moment to allow Naruto to sit closer to her. She then put her feet down gently onto Naruto's lap. Naruto eyed her bare feet for a second before slowly and softly dragging his finger down the middle of one. Hinata immediately started laughing and squirming all over again. No, not my feet. Hinata yelled playfully as she tried to wrestle out of Naruto's grip. As the two continued to play and wrestle, Hideki and his father were wandering around outside the Hyuga complex. You sure they live here, father? Hideki asked as he leaned against a tall wooden post. I'm pretty sure we have passed this post before. Asuka frowned. Hiashi would never let the clan's precious hairless live anywhere else other than here. And I would bet my entire fortune that Hiashi, that pompous, built his daughter her very own house. And I would also bet that he hasn't finished it yet. So all we need to look for is a house that is still in construction. Hideki rubbed his temples with his fingers. Yes, I understand that. But we have looked all over this damn complex several times and there are no half-finished houses. Asuka hung his head. He hated being wrong. I guess it's time for Plan B. Plan B. Ask for directions. Asuka said with way too much pride. He quickly spotted the nearest Hyuga and ran up to question him. Excuse me, sir. I'm a wood contractor and I heard you guys recently bought a large quantity from my company. I'm here for just a follow-up. The Hyuga frowned. Well, it's not really my area of expertise, but we did build that entire house a while ago. The Hyuga gestured to a large house behind him. Something to do with the young heiress, I believe. Asuka's eyes widened. You mean it's already been built? Almost. The main part is done, but Hiyashi still wants to add several more wings to it. I guess we will be needing a lot more wood in the near future. The Hyuga gave Asuka a brief smile and excused himself. Asuka went back to his son with a triumphant smile on his face. It looks like I was partly right after all. And I found the location of their house. Hideki smiled sinisterly. Good. Lead the way. Meanwhile, Naruto and Hinata were lying on the couch trying to catch their breath. Hinata stood up and went over to pick up the cushions she had thrown across the room. However, she forgot that the only thing she was wearing was Naruto's shirt. She bent over to pick up the cushion and Naruto froze as he was visually reminded what Hinata was, or rather, wasn't wearing. Naruto's cheeks burned and he let out a sharp gasp. Hinata suddenly remembered that she wasn't wearing underwear and she quickly stood up and pulled Naruto's shirt back down past her hips. Hinata's cheeks matched Naruto's as she turned around slowly. Should Goji get dressed? She muttered as she ran upstairs holding the shirt below her hips. Naruto nodded slowly, his face frozen in shock. He didn't even notice Hinata was already upstairs. What was that? Hinata mentally yelled at herself as she got dressed in her usual clothes. He has already seen me. Why am I still embarrassed? Why was I okay this morning and not right now? Hinata thought back to the shower they had shared the previous night and the romantic moment they had shared this morning. Maybe it's because he told me he likes me. Or maybe it's because I hadn't expected to expose myself like that. There was a loud knock at the front door and Hinata nearly jumped out of her skin. She heard Naruto open the door, so she took another moment to straighten her hair before going downstairs. Hello, Naruto said as he pulled open the door. His brow furrowed as he looked upon the two men standing in front of him. He had never seen them before, but there was something Naruto felt like he was missing. It was a boy who looked only a few years older than Naruto and an older man who was most likely his father. They both had long, dark hair as black as night and they were both dressed in extremely expensive clothes. But the thing that caught Naruto's attention was their piercingly cold stare. There was something strange about their eyes. Can I help you? Naruto asked after a moment of awkward silence. The young boy smiled and stepped forward. Yes. Are you Naruto Uzumaki? Naruto nodded and opened the door wider so the two men could step inside. As they got further inside and closer to Naruto, Naruto felt his stomach churn. Something was not right. As I was saying, the young boy spoke up. I was wondering if Hideki Kenji. Naruto and the two men turned suddenly to face the stairs. Naruto frowned as he noticed a faint smile twist at the corners of the boy's mouth. Naruto's hand instinctively went for his kunai pouch on his right leg, but his hand only grasped empty space. Naruto cursed mentally as he remembered all of his ninja equipment was upstairs. Hinata came down from the stairs to stand by Naruto's side. She reached over to wrap her hand around Naruto's. She really needed his courage right now. Hideki gave her the creeps. What are you doing here, Hideki? I thought I said I wanted nothing to do with you. Hinata said with more strength than she realized she had. Naruto was also impressed and he squeezed Hinata's hand reassuringly. Hideki laughed quietly even though Hinata's words had cut him deeply. He quelled his anger and spoke very softly. That's why I'm here. I plan on fixing that. Hideki took a menacing step forward towards Hinata. Naruto quickly stepped in front of him. I think it's time for you to leave. Hideki ignored Naruto and focused his gaze on Hinata. Hinata shuddered, but she remained firm, refusing to look away. Hideki's irises flashed a furious shade of yellow and Hinata felt her knees go weak. Suddenly there was a loud crash as Naruto was thrown several feet into the wall. Hinata gasped and tried to run to Naruto's side, but Hideki caught her and held her in place. Hinata watched in terror as Asuka walked over to Naruto's crumpled body. Her body went cold as Asuka picked Naruto up by the neck. Naruto started struggling as his airway was violently squeezed shut. Hinata's world went dark and time seemed to slow as she watched Asuka pull a long knife out of his jacket. She opened her mouth to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. Fear gripped her heart as she wrestled with Hideki's tight grip. She was completely helpless as she watched Asuka drive the blade into Naruto's chest, piercing his heart. Naruto's feet suddenly stopped kicking and his arms fell to his sides. He slowly turned his head to look at Hinata as blood dribbled out of his mouth. He mouthed Hinata's name before completely going limp. Naruto ooh! Hinata screamed as Asuka threw Naruto's lifeless body to the ground. Pain and horror flooded into her as tears poured from her eyes. Hideki let go of her and she sank to her knees. She outstretched her hand trying to reach Naruto, but her world suddenly went black.